Today, we're at the Northern Neck News, old newspaper building here in Warsaw, Virginia. And next to me is a Babcock Reliance press from the 19th century. So we estimate it's from 1895. There's some patent wording here that has the most recent one saying 95. Of course, it's not 1995, right? Different people will refer to this kind of press in different ways. You could call it a rotary. It's got this big wheel that takes the sheet, spins, presses it down. You could call it a flatbed because the type, that of course is reversed, sits on the flatbed, goes back and forth, picks up ink here, takes the paper, prints it, drops it out through there. So you call it flatbed, shoom, shoom. Letterpress, the little reverse type that sits in the stereotype, the big set that you would put there.
You can also call it a cylinder press for pretty obvious reasons.
From what the building owners were told, the last time this press was run was in the 60s.
This sheet counter had 65 set on it, so that's what we figured.
Now, last people who shut it off, they didn't do wash up. There's still ink in the tray. But at least they put it on these rollers, so it'll be easy to get out. Easy to get out. The building owners, Roy and Don, they both, bought this building, found it down here, and they don't want it to go to the scrapper, but frankly, for a letterpress this old, there's a lot of them knocking around.
There are at least 2 running Babcocks that I know of. One at the Braddock News Letterpress Museum in Linton, North Dakota, that's part of the South Central Threshing Association, a nonprofit in Braddock, and another running Babcock at the Printers Hall at the Midwest Old Threshers Reunion in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Wild West legend Buffalo Bill owned a Babcock standard, which he bought for his sister's Duluth, Minnesota newspaper. He then used it for his own paper, the Cody Enterprise, in the Wyoming town that he founded. It was used there for a couple of decades before being sold to a paper out in California. That Babcock would find its way back to Cody, Wyoming, because that California newspaper donated the press to the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. There's also plenty of similar letterpresses, like this Cranston, preserved in Colorado, and a pair of rotaries from the 1880s that are kept by the Museum of Printing in Massachusetts.
We're estimating the weight at around 4,500 to 5,000 pounds. Certainly no, as Alan, one of these fellows, said, there's no Ozempic for iron presses like this. 4,500 pounds to 5,000 pounds does sound a lot, especially for a relatively simple piece of machinery like this. But Babcock was making stuff that was as heavy as 16 ton. So, dinky little thing compared to what else they were putting out.
Let's go back in time here for a second and talk about the company that designed and built this printing press. It starts with these 2 New England fellas, Nathaniel Babcock and Calvert Cottrell, in 1855.
The company was originally called Cottrell and Babcock Manufacturing Company, and they had about 50 employees making about 20 different kinds of machines. That ranged from cotton processors to woodworking kit, and of course, they picked up military contracts during the Civil War. But again, they started to kind of lean into printing presses, especially as the Civil War ended. And in 1880, after about a dozen solid years of focusing on presses, their popularity continued to grow. Cottrell offered to let Babcock buy out his half of the company. Now, part of the success in those intervening years of the Babcock company was actually through a family member who turned out to be a bit of a phenom in designing printing machinery. His name was George Fenner, and he was a nephew of Babcock. Now, I've also got differing sources that say that Cottrell was actually the genius behind a lot of the success of the manufacturing company. And he would go on to actually start a different printing press company up there in Connecticut that would grow and change like most of these printing press companies at this point,
So it's unsurprising Babcock and Cottrell's split turned antagonistic, if it ever was amiable to begin with, as Cottrell sued Babcock to make the latter stop building presses and competing with Cottrell, which Cottrell thought was originally part of the split. Ultimately, the case went to the Connecticut Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of Babcock that he and Fenner could continue to build presses. 4 years before the case was decided, Fenner had convinced his uncle Babcock to move their now printing press-focused plant about 10 miles to the west to New London, Connecticut, to be closer to the port.
And after this move, business just kept getting better. You know, between 1883 and 1919, they sold about over 7,000 printing presses, and were, again, that access to the sea gave them an export market. Canada, Mexico, Europe, and even parts of Asia. At that New London, Connecticut facility, Fenner, the family, the Babcocks, their engineers designed a new press called the Optimist, which became very popular in magazine printing. In 1899, the company was taking up 180,000 square feet of industrial space and employed about 250 guys.
Time marched on. Babcock died of heart failure in his late 70s in May 1902. He was one of 11 children and a descendant of the first white settlers of Westerly, Rhode Island in the 1640s, and he was remembered as having lived an impactful, patriotic life for the success of his printing press company and as an early supporter of both abolition and prohibition. This passage in his obit may be a subtweet of Cottrell. Fenner died suddenly in 1915 and was remembered as a genial, hard-working, charitable inventor who was the perfect teammate with his uncle, the organizer. He was also the lieutenant governor candidate for the Prohibition Party several times. Cottrell died at the age of 72. He was also remembered as a great inventor, and funnily enough, the company bearing his family's name would eventually be bought by the massively successful and large Harris-Seibold Company. But again, we'll talk about Cottrell's printing presses in another video. Babcock's company, however, would have a less prosperous fate. Their esteem seemed to fall as the time without Babcock or Fenner lengthened, and they were down to 70 employees in the late 20s. Yet they had a bit of a renaissance in the years leading up just before World War II, selling multicolor web presses to large magazine operations. By 1938, Babcock was back up to 300 employees and had a $1 million a year. The sales price of these massive web presses was far beyond the relatively paltry price tags of those small flatbed cylinder presses like this Warsaw Reliance that used to be the company's bedrock of work. Yet I found fewer ads in trade magazines, and the trail really starts to go cold. For sure, the company occupied 200,000 square feet of floor space in Canton, Ohio, as of August 24, 1946, in a facility built by Timken Detroit Axle Company in 1917. A Philadelphian named C.W. Ginsburg was named president of the company on May 27, 1953. Babcock was in bankruptcy proceedings in 1962, and the building site is now a highway intersection.
So that's about the sum of it. You know, we'll see if we can get her out. It'd be great, but there's so many of them knocking around. If we can't save it, we tried. Good metal, though. I'll make them like they used to.